The NBA is built on skill, pressure, money, and legacy, but for some players, there's something even bigger than basketball. For Darren Collison, Dave Meyers, and Danny Granger, life was shaped by a faith that changed how they saw success, sacrifice, and purpose. Darren Collison publicly said in 2019 that he retired after 10 NBA seasons to focus on his faith as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Dave Meyers was a high draft pick and successful NBA big man whose life and career were also tied to that faith. Danny Granger, meanwhile, became known not only as an all-star but as another NBA player connected to Jehovah's Witnesses. This is a story about three players, three different eras, and one faith that influenced the way each man lived. To understand these stories, you first have to understand the relationship between Jehovah's Witnesses and sports. The faith does not forbid athletics altogether, but it generally discourages making sports the center of life. And for most rank and file witnesses, spiritual duties come first. That means meetings, ministry, and a life shaped by religious priorities usually take precedence over competition, trophies, or public recognition. And over the years, there have been numerous articles published in the Watchtower literature that warns against pursuing sport as a career or playing in the top flight. This article in the Awake magazine of 1991, entitled "Should I Join a School Team?" says this: some school athletes also dream about going on to become professional players. I dreamed of playing in the city and state championships and ultimately in the pros, said young Gerald. I saw myself getting rich, endorsing many products, being in the Hall of Fame, being a role model, and dating the prettiest girl in school. Little wonder, then, that sports in many schools are played with almost life and death urgency. Fun and fitness fade into the background. As 17 went on to say, suddenly winning overrides concerns about honesty, schoolwork, health, happiness, and most other important aspects of life. Winning becomes everything, and the pressure builds. With this win-at-all-cost attitude prevailing, it is no surprise that a flood of injuries has plagued school athletics. Violence by athletes, fans, and even parents sometimes accompanies games. And use of performance-enhancing drugs such as steroids is becoming widespread even among teenage athletes. So while playing on a team may have some limited advantages, it may also engender an overly competitive spirit, fantasies of great wealth, and an egotistical desire for glory. These things clearly go contrary to the Bible's counsel not to be stirring up competition with one another, not to love money, and not to be seeking personal glory. Joining a school team could very well expose you to unwholesome influences in a very intense way. In practical terms, that creates tension with the world of elite athletics. Sports at a high level demand obsession, long hours, physical sacrifice, and a mindset built around performance and winning. Jehovah's Witnesses tend to emphasize humility, moderation, and avoiding anything that could pull attention away from the worship or the ministry. So while a witness may still play sports, the culture around the faith often treats athletics as something secondary, not a career to worship. That is why the stories of these three NBA players stand out. They all made it to the highest level of basketball, but they did so while carrying a belief system that put very different demands on their lives. For some witnesses, sports are fine as recreation. For others, especially when competition becomes intense or consuming, there can be real conflict between the spiritual life and the athletic one. That tension matters here because it helps explain why Darren Collison's retirement felt so surprising, why Dave Meyers is remembered as part of a longer and quieter history, and why Danny Granger's career has also drawn attention beyond the box score. Darren Collison's NBA story looked like a classic success arc. He was a quick, reliable point guard who carved out a 10-year career in the league and earned a reputation as a steady floor leader. He played for multiple teams, including the Hornets, Pacers, Clippers, Kings, and the Warriors, and became known for professionalism and efficiency. Then in June 2019, Collison shocked the basketball world by announcing he was retiring at just 31 years old. The reason was not injury, it wasn't burnout, it was faith. Collison said he was one of Jehovah's Witnesses and that his beliefs and family meant more to him than continuing his NBA career. And ESPN reported the announcement as follows. Veteran guard Darren Collison has decided to retire from the NBA after 10 seasons, primarily to concentrate on helping the less fortunate through his Jehovah's Witness faith. He told ESPN's The Undefeated in a letter. While I still love basketball, I know there is something more important, which is my family and my faith. Collison wrote Friday, I am one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and my faith means everything to me. I receive so much joy from volunteering to help others and participate in a worldwide ministry. The joy I feel is unmatched. With that being said, I have decided to retire from the NBA. That decision made headlines because it went against nearly everything the sports world expects from an athlete in his prime. And most players would hold on as long as possible. Most would chase one more contract, one more playoff, one more chance at the bigger role. Collison did the opposite. He stepped away while he was still capable of contributing at a high level. In his public comments, Collison made it clear that his choice was rooted in more than personal preference. He spoke about wanting to focus on his faith and on the ministry work associated with Jehovah's Witnesses. And that is a huge part of why his retirement was so notable. He did not frame it as a loss. He framed it as a priority. And that priority fits the larger culture of the faith. Jehovah's Witnesses are generally taught to put spiritual life ahead of worldly achievement. That can mean turning down opportunities others would consider life-changing. In Collison's case, it meant walking away from the NBA at the peak of his earning power and public visibility. And for witnesses, it was an example of someone choosing spiritual conviction over professional status. Dave Meyers belonged to an earlier era. He was a standout at UCLA, one of the most dominant programs in college basketball history, and then became the second overall pick in the 1975 NBA draft, selected by the Milwaukee Bucks. On paper, he looked like the kind of player that could build a long and productive professional career. Meyers played 4 seasons in the NBA, and his best years came in Milwaukee. He was a skilled forward who could score, rebound, and pass. In the 77-78 season, he posted solid numbers and showed the kind of versatility that made him valuable in his era. And unlike Darren Collison, Meyers played in a time when athletes were less likely to publicly explain their faith in detail. So his connection to Jehovah's Witnesses is less of a headline story and more of a historical thread, one that places him inside a broader tradition of players, balancing elite sports with religious identity. That is important because it shows this is not a new phenomenon. The tension between professional athletes and expectations of Jehovah's Witnesses has existed for decades. Meyers' story reminds us that even in earlier generations, there were players whose personal beliefs shaped the way they moved through the basketball world. His career also illustrates something else. Not every faith-related story in sports ends with a dramatic public statement. Some are quieter. Some are only visible when you look back at a player's life and understand the larger context. Meyers may not have become famous for leaving the game of a faith, but he remains a meaningful part of the conversation because his life sits at that intersection of basketball, identity, and belief. Meyers was a strong Jehovah's Witness member, and his faith carried on until his last breath. He was devoted to the extent of refusing surgery after a severe back injury. As the LA Times reported, He said that the operation was against his faith and Jehovah's Witness principles. That was possibly alluding to the blood transfusion policy. Dave succumbed to his cancer at the age of 62 in 2015. Danny Granger represents another version of the story. He was one of the best wing players of his era, especially during his peak with the Indiana Pacers, where he became an all-star and the centerpiece of a competitive team. He was known for his scoring, size, and ability to stretch the floor, so to speak. In his case, the faith was not known primarily because of a dramatic retirement decision. Instead, it was part of his personal identity while he was living the life of a professional athlete, much like the Williams sisters, which I will cover in depth in a separate video. That distinction matters. Not every witness-connected athlete experiences the same level of public conflict. Some players, like Granger, are able to move through the league while keeping their beliefs in the background. Their faith remains important, but it does not always become the headline. Still, the broader point remains the same. A faith that encourages modesty, prioritizes ministry, and treats worldly success with caution does not naturally match the culture of professional sports. So, even when a player like Granger is not making a public statement about retirement or sacrifice, the underlying tension is still there. He is part of a system that values celebrity while belonging to a faith that warns against letting worldly status take over your identity. And that makes Granger's story useful because it shows another way this can look. Not every athlete tied to Jehovah's Witnesses leaves the league early. Not every athlete makes a dramatic announcement. Sometimes the influence of faith shows up in a quieter way, in discipline, in values, in the way a player carries himself, and in the choices he makes off the court. The reason these stories resonate is because they expose a deeper tension. Basketball asks for total commitment. Jehovah's Witnesses ask for spiritual commitment first. And these two systems can coexist, but they do not always fit easily together. For the average Jehovah's Witness, sports are usually not supposed to become a defining identity. A person may play casually, maybe even competitively in school or local leagues, but the culture of the faith generally pushes against the idea that athletic success should become the main goal in life. Ministry, worship, and spiritual obedience are supposed to come first.
What's another thing perhaps that could cause us to lose a measure of neutrality? Sporting events. Sometimes sporting events are able to achieve certain goals with regard to nationalism. We see the national anthem being played, many of these events. It reminds me, many years ago, when I was in a different country, a friend of mine asked me to record a certain sporting event. I wasn't particularly interested in the event, but because he made this request, I recorded it. And of course, I wanted to make sure that I'd got the last 10 minutes of it. I thought our friendship may be strained if I didn't get the actual last part of the game. When I watched it, it was absolutely exciting, nail-biting finish. Well, after the brother gave me back the videotape, I thought maybe some of the other brothers who would be interested in this sporting event may want to have it rather than just wipe the tape. So I offered it to several. And each one of them said to me, no, thanks. If we had won, perhaps it would be different. Now, what was the problem? As I said to them, were you watching the game or were you taking sides? An interesting concept because here two different nations were involved. So we have to be careful that even sporting events don't stir up within us certain nationalistic feelings. And perhaps we could take sides with regard to certain events.
That is why the NBA examples are so fascinating. These men reached a level of athletic success that most people only dream about, but their lives were shaped by a belief system that would not automatically celebrate that success in the same way the wider world does. In fact, it might even create pressure to keep that success in perspective. That does not mean every witness feels the same way about sports or that every family approaches the issue identically. But the overall religious culture tends to be cautious about the place sports can take in a person's life. It is less about banning a basketball game and more about resisting the idea that sports should become a person's whole identity. And in addition, there's the constant warning against bad association and the world. That is the core reason Collison's retirement was such a powerful statement. He was not just leaving a job, he was publicly showing that faith had higher value than the career the world celebrates most. These stories matter because they show different answers to the same question. What do you do when the world gives you fame, money, and attention, but your faith asks for something else? Darren Collison answered by walking away. Dave Meyers lived in an earlier era where the connection was quieter, but still part of his life story. Danny Granger showed that a player can live at the highest level of the sport while still being shaped by a faith that places limits on how sports are supposed to function in a person's life. And taken together, they show that the NBA is not just a place of highlights and contracts. It is also a place where beliefs collide with ambition and where personal conviction can sometimes matter more than the game itself. The playoffs may be about who wins the championship, but the most memorable stories often live outside the box score. And Darren Collison, Dave Meyers, and Danny Granger each showed in different ways what it looks like when faith and basketball meet. For some players, the game is everything. For these men, it was something else, part of the journey, but not the final destination. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.